Well, it's time for the sermon. I promise it will be just as hard to follow as my homily was earlier. And I salute your courage today because most of you knew we were going to talk about politics this morning, and you showed up anyway. And perhaps we should take a few deep breaths to prepare for this ordeal and allow a shudder to vibrate through our bodies. Because we've got to deal with some repulsive, repugnant, repellent realities. There's no use in trying to put lipstick on this pig. Politics today is just plain ugly. But as ghastly as it is, we need to talk about politics because Unitarian Universalist values are under merciless attack in our nation. In full disclosure, I'll say that I myself tend to be politically progressive. However, I also appreciate moderates and conservatives who support humanitarian values. And sometimes we have seen a creative tension between liberals and conservatives, as when liberals suggest programs for helping the disadvantaged, and conservatives point out flaws in those programs. But these days, political tensions are seldom creative. I also want to say that even though I'm going to be talking about party politics, and I'll be critical of one leader in particular, I do not for a single second presume to tell you how you should vote. For one thing, someone that I criticize might run against someone you think is even worse. My sermon title was inspired by a 1956 doo-wop song, Stranded in the Jungle by the Cadets, with its famous refrain, "Meanwhile, back in the jungle." And it ties into a sermon series I presented 12 years ago here called Graduates of Eden, about human nature and our jungle heritage. Our mental and physical nature is well suited for living in small bands of hunter-gatherers out in the open wilderness. When food was plentiful, this was at times a sort of Eden. And we didn't get kicked out of this Garden of Eden because we were naughty. We did so well in our prehistoric Eden that we graduated, growing into larger, more complicated societies. Our human accomplishments transformed the human world, but human nature is still fitted to the old world that we lost. And in that sermon, I mentioned 3 crucial mismatches between human nature and the new world we've created. First, we are easily confused by complexity, but we keep making our lives more complicated. Second, we are tribal creatures who love those who are on our team, but often ignore or attack outsiders. And third, we are generally oblivious to problems that develop slowly, such as climate change. In each of these 3 ways, we are being faithful to inner biological imperatives. As a group, we humans are not evil or stupid, but we are dangerously successful. Today I'll add another item to this list, our obsession with dominance. One day while reading about dominance, hierarchies within monkeys, I had one of those bingo moments. I suddenly realized what a huge amount of human behavior is shaped by our love of domination. Dominance involves who wins and who loses, who's right and who's wrong, who's good and who's bad. People are drawn toward these issues like moths to a flame. If we want to go beyond our built-in biological limitations, we need to work on our own hearts and minds. Whenever we see other people doing destructive things, we can say to ourselves, meanwhile, back in the jungle, meanwhile, back in my brain, maybe I'm acting the same way as those I criticize. Do they seem like they're fooling around like a bunch of baboons? Well, we're primates too. I will explore two overall themes this morning, and my first main theme is that we should stop being shocked when humans follow human nature. For example, we should just assume that we're not good at solving complicated problems. Of course the modern world's too complicated for us. That's why we love it when our leaders feed us solutions that are so charmingly simple. And sometimes the leaders themselves actually believe in simple solutions. As one of them said in dismay, nobody knew healthcare could be so complicated. One complicating factor is that functioning in the modern world requires an almost impossible level of consistency, and human attention is notoriously inconsistent. Take weapons, for example. In prehistoric times, the worst accident you could have with your weapon was to accidentally drop your club on your toe. Guns are a different matter. And I think that many gun rights advocates do not realize or underestimate the fact that people will always be inconsistent in gun safety. Last March, as our leaders were discussing arming school teachers, guns were accidentally fired in our schools by adults twice in one day. Once in California, once in Virginia. In Seaside, California, a gun was accidentally fired into the ceiling with shrapnel coming down and injuring one student. Fired there by a reserved police officer during a gun safety class. Yeah. And there have actually been many similar cases in recent years where somebody who's trained in gun safety and dealing with guns has accidentally fired a weapon in a school or has lost their weapon and some student has found it. But gun safety lapses are trivial compared to the astoundingly irresponsible policies we have about nuclear weapons. Just one example. The President of the United States can launch a nuclear attack even if we are not being attacked. The President could nuke Antarctica if he suddenly decided he hated penguins. It's absurd to grant any human being that ability, knowing that we are fallible and inconsistent, and sometimes just for no apparent reason, go off the rails. As I mentioned, people also have trouble focusing on problems that develop slowly, such as climate change. So in discussing climate change, we need to speak on a familiar human time scale. For example, imagine driving a car through a blind intersection where buildings block your view to the right and the left. Ask a climate change denier, would you zip through that blind intersection at 50 miles an hour? No, you'd slow down and look both ways. Even if there was very little chance of a crash, the cost of the crash would be too high to justify taking that risk. And with global warming and rising sea levels, it takes a long time to put on the brakes and stop dumping massive amounts of greenhouse gases into the air. Therefore, you don't have to say there's certainty of global warming and climate change. Even if there's only a small chance of disastrous warming, we should reduce those emissions just in case. So let's stop being amazed that people have trouble with complexity and slowly developing problems, and let's also stop being shocked that humans are tribal. We will always have to help ourselves and our children cope with this biological programming. Columnist David Brooks recently reported a remarkable example. As late as 2015, Republican voters overwhelmingly supported free trade. Just 3 years later, they overwhelmingly oppose it. The shift didn't happen because of some mass reappraisal of the evidence. It's just that tribal orthodoxy shifted and everyone followed. One obvious example of tribalism is the backlash against immigration in Europe and America. And part of the problem is that many people find it stressful to be around people who are different. I think there's something in our programming when someone who's in some way unfamiliar to us comes into our presence, something in us alerts, and some people start feeling very uncomfortable. Joanne and I were drawn to the Tri-Cities area partly because of ethnic diversity here, but obviously not everyone feels this way. Should I be content with just scolding them because they're inferior? They don't like diversity the way that we do? Listen to this complaint about immigration from 1751. Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? Who was this person who wouldn't have liked Herr Schriner moving into the neighborhood? Benjamin Franklin. I'm not sure how to deal with this aspect of tribalism, but at least I will say I'm encouraged to see how often the term tribalism is being used these days to talk about our situation. So, meanwhile, back in our jungle, how should you deal with malignant tribalism? We could start by reality checking our own opinions. Here's a question for you. When you read or listen to statements that agree with your opinions, do you often notice bias, logical fallacies, and exaggerations? I hope you're catching these glitches frequently and not just occasionally, because I'll bet they are there. For example, Joanne and I subscribe to the New York Times. I read it religiously. I love it. But I've been surprised to see that its news stories do a lot more editorializing and slanting around than I expected. That gives me good practice every day in staying alert when I'm reading, rather than just swallowing everything everything I'm fed. So that's my first theme. Stop being shocked when humans follow human nature. My second main theme is that when our favored social causes are losing, that is probably an opportunity for creative disillusionment. Facing painful truths so we can deal with these truths instead of ducking them. In coping with personal life issues, many of us here, I'm sure, have become stronger after we lost some cherished personal illusion. And in politics, some of my own veils of illusion have been rudely ripped away. A candidate that I thought would only attract a small fringe of support is now president. Over and over, he has done things that should have alienated many of his supporters. He's proudly and flamboyantly cruel, endorsing torture, encouraging violence against protesters, and punishing those we accuse of violating immigration laws by taking away their children. He brutally humiliates people, spraying insults willy-nilly like a skunk run amok. He's made many statements that sound quite racist, and he repeatedly insults the intelligence of his supporters by spouting nonsense, like tweeting, there is no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea. Don't you feel reassured? By the way, back in 2015, I heard him make an infamous comment about Megyn Kelly, which I will not repeat in a sermon, and I thought, that is a big red flag. This fellow sounds twisted. So I started watching him very closely after that. I can't give him a diagnosis without interviewing him, But I think there's something seriously the matter. I've seen lots of other huge red flags over and over again. The latest one, for me anyway, was him openly scolding Attorney General Jeff Sessions for allowing 2 Republican congressmen to be indicted because it might cost Republicans 2 seats in the House. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you whisper to your Attorney General. You don't say it out loud. Obvious, public, blatant attack on the rule of law. Republican Senator Susan Collins called his statement appalling and unbelievable. Another Republican compared it to being like in a banana republic, which is sort of insulting to our neighbors to the south. Of course, many people are so blinded by tribalism that they don't notice, and people have often defended thuggish behavior by their political allies. When the Watergate investigation began in 1972, Bob Dole called the allegations against Nixon unfounded mudslinging. Gerald Ford, who later became president, called it a political witch hunt. Does that sound familiar? And probably the Democrats sometimes support a president from their party when they shouldn't, but I don't notice because they're on my side. It's tempting to think that the president's supporters will suddenly wake up and realize they've been snookered. But how long have I been thinking that? A survey in April showed that 89% of Republicans have a positive impression of the president. Clearly, I have failed to understand his supporters. In this way, he has proven me wrong over and over. I can live in denial about that, or I can realize that being wrong over and over means I have something to learn here. One thing I think I'm learning is that a lot of what's called conservative Christianity has little to do with Jesus. Now, I will say very clearly that many conservative churches help some of their members follow Jesus and follow Christian values. But the president's greed, deception, egotism, cruelty, hostility, and vengefulness are all just the opposite of Jesus' teachings. And what about sexual exploitation? Even before the videotape came out, where he boasted about being a serial sex offender, we already had tapes from the Howard Stern TV show with him bragging about barging into Miss Universe dressing rooms to leer at unclothed women. Illegal voyeurism. We should have called this guy Peeping Don. With all these unchristian actions, you'd think that biblical fundamentalists would be sounding the alarm. Behold, here is the Antichrist, prophesied by Scripture. Yet in April, white evangelical approval for the president hit its highest level ever, 75%. Do conservative Christians even grasp the basic teachings of Jesus? And of course, some churches actively discourage their children from questioning church doctrine. They systematically train children to overlook obvious theological problems. The message is, do not question the beliefs of our tribe. Perhaps we see the results in the way these children vote when they grow up. But back in our jungle, what about Unitarian Universalism? I do think we help our children by teaching them to question and to think for themselves. I think there's no doubt about that. But to what extent do our RE programs make a positive difference in the lives of our young people? To what extent is membership in our congregations helping our children and adults to act on our highest values? Something to reflect on. We can point fingers at fundamentalists for not living up to Christian values, but let's be sure we're living up to our own. One thing UUs could clearly do a lot better is to deal with the human drive toward dominance. Have you noticed how often people argue about issues that could easily be resolved without acrimony? But without an argument, How are we going to jockey for position on the ladder of domination? That is a general human problem, and I doubt that UUs are any better than average here. Last year, controversies about institutional racism roiled our denomination, leading to the resignation of the UUA president and the president of the UU Ministers Association. I've been dismayed at some of the hostile and provocative communications during this controversy. But even talented and dedicated UUs may be motivated by the desire to dominate. In local churches, too, any major congregational controversy tempts people toward tribalism, hostility, and dominance. I hope that in this dear congregation, we are learning to cope with conflict with skillfulness, respect, and humility, and that we are systematically teaching these skills to our children. If UUs can learn to disagree respectfully, we will have more credibility when we complain about obnoxious politicians. We humans are not inherently evil, but we are perilously successful. We are so good at complicating our societies and so clueless about taming ancient tribal impulses and the drive toward domination. But woven into our DNA is also an astonishing inventiveness and the drive toward improving our lives. Our present difficulties call us to mobilize these virtues. Even if social activism isn't your thing, think about whether you can devote extra time and personal resources to social action during the next few years. One of our worship themes at Mission Peak is covenant, and a covenant is a set of promises we make to each other. We need to make these promises because being in community takes work. It doesn't come naturally to be in community with diverse opinions. It's hard. It's the spiritual work of rising above all limitations. We are stranded deep in the jungle, but we have a moral compass and we can find our way out. So let us find that true path, my friends, and let us discover new and wondrous ways to love and bless this world. May it be so. Amen.